Bruchim habayim and welcome. It is an honor and pleasure to welcome you to Temple de Hirsch Sinai as we welcome to our community, to our synagogue community, greater Jewish community, greater Seattle community, Ambassador Michael Oren. I just want to take a moment to offer a few tokens of gratitude. First to Wendy Rosen and Amy Reagan of the American Jewish Committee for so much heavy lifting and inspiration and energy in bringing this event here. And within our temple staff, in addition to the entire temple staff, a special shout out to Stacy Giacchino, who is our logistics and program organizer and director. We thank her very much. Yeah, she's definitely worthy. Many of us come here this evening with varying views, differing views on Israel's politics and policy, but there are some staples which we all share. We all have fears for Israel's survival in the face of an existential nuclear Iranian threat. We all are concerned about increasing movements of delegitimization of Israel around the world and within this nation, and particularly this community. And virtually all of us are concerting our efforts toward a secure and stable Israel, one that will survive and endure and flourish for many years to come. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome Ambassador Michael Oren and to introduce the ambassador. I'd like to call forth a wonderful figure in our Pacific Northwest and Western regional Jewish community, Consul General Akiva Tor, who is actually, his tenure is coming to an end, and we say wistfully, Shalom, lehitraot. We know that there are wonderful things awaiting you, and we are indebted, deeply indebted, for your wonderful efforts in this community and throughout the West Coast. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Akiva Tor. Excuse me, Consul General Akiva Tor.
Rabbi Wiener, from your ears to the Appointments Committee in the Foreign Ministry, may your entreaties and words be heard on high. Friends, Jewish community, greater community, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank Temple de Hirsch Sinai, your wonderful staff, the Jewish community organizations that came together to make this wonderful evening. Before I introduce Ambassador Oren, it behooves me to say shalom. I've finished now 4 years of service in the Bay Area and the 5 other states that I'm responsible for. It's time for my wife and my 4 children and our dog to return home to Eretz Yisrael, to Eretz HaKodesh. I've had a wonderful time here. My family has thrived and grown, but it's time for my daughter, my oldest, to begin her army service. And frankly, as a family, we just miss Israel terribly. And it's time for us to go home, where I will be working in the foreign ministry there. So I was trying to think what would be a wonderful and appropriate goodbye present to the Seattle Jewish community. And by great serendipity and luck, it became possible for me to really present a wonderful going-away gift in the person of the Ambassador of Israel, Michael Oren. And I'm so happy to bring him here this evening. Ambassador Oren is a noted historian. He was a warrior, an officer in the Tzanchanim, the Israeli paratroops. And I think that he is really the ultimate. He wrote a wonderful article called The Ultimate Ally, which is about the relationship between the State of Israel and the United States. But I think that Ambassador Oren is the ultimate ambassador. I can tell you, I've known him now for several years. He works around the clock. He's completely devoted through love and patriotism and tzionut to his job. He has been for me a mentor, a source of wisdom, a source of strength in difficult periods, and dugma lechikui, an example of the kind of diplomat that I would like to be. Ambassador Oren, thank you so much for your efforts. We've worked hard from early dawn. We began, first we flew in from DC last night, and then we were in the radio, and then we were in the Seattle Times, and then we met with the interfaith community and with the various ethnic communities. and then we did some other things in the afternoon, and thank you so much. It was wonderful. I think the ambassador will tell you. Thank you so much for all your work, and thank you for coming to Seattle. Please welcome Ambassador Michael Oren.
Kiva, you're already an ambassador in my eyes. You've always been an ambassador in my eyes. What a great friend. What a great representative of Israel. We're very fortunate to have had him here for these 4 years. Erev Tov. Good evening. Good evening to members of the Diplomatic Corps, to Lieutenant Governor Brad Owen, to Wendy Rosen, who made my day very memorable. What Kiva says, we did other things. We toured the Boeing factory, because El Al's interested in some airplanes. And we had a very moving and meaningful meeting with author Karl Merlantes. Because when I found out that I was coming to Seattle, I said I wanted to meet Karl Merlantes because I had read his books on Vietnam and what it meant to go to war. And both Kiva and I both served in the paratroopers and have been at war. We know what that's like. And it was to sit and talk with Karl and talk about how we overcame the experiences, the profound traumas of dealing with, of living through warfare and great violence was very special for both of us. Very special indeed. Now, having said all that, I'm going to surprise you by opening my remarks by saying, as Israeli ambassador, I confront some challenges. You got over that? Okay. You may have noticed there's some upheaval going around the Middle East. There are civil wars on our borders. The peace process in recent years looks more like a peace recess. In America, there is political polarization. There are economic difficulties, rising gas prices. I'm sure you've noticed that. In our particular line of work, working in the foreign ministry, we have to deal with bureaucracy, a lot of bureaucracy. But the hardest challenge I face, and if my wife Sally's not with me tonight, she's off in Chicago giving a speech for Hadassah, but if she were with me tonight, she would agree with me when I tell you that the hardest challenge we face is being apart from our children. They're grown up now. Unlike Akiva's kids, our kids are a little bit older. They're young Israeli adults. They're independent and they're thriving. But it's difficult being apart from them, especially when they, too, are confronting challenges. Now, my mother used to tell me, parenthood is a life sentence. Now, get this, my mother tells me this. How depressing is that? And you all know the expression, you know, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. And I'll amend that to our situation. If you have little Israeli kids, you have little Israeli problems. You've got big Israeli kids, you've got big Israeli problems. So take, for example, our eldest son, Yoav, who's not actually in Israel at all, but he is in Shanghai, China. He served in an elite unit of the IDF. He was wounded. He was actually... Oh, thank you. I once, as a student, I hosted Bashevis Singer right after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He says, I'm not going to speak until I get a glass of water. I got to have a glass of water. So we all ran out to get him 5 glasses of water, and we lined them up on top of the dais. And he says, I'm not going to drink them. I'm only going to look at them. So I just want to look at that, okay? Take my son, Yoav. He's working in Shanghai, China, as I said. He served in an elite unit in the IDF where he was wounded. He was shot at close range in a raid against a Hamas commander. They caught him. Yoav is fine today. And he had a dream his whole life. His dream was to finish the army and go off to China. Always fascinated with China. And there he learned to speak fluent Chinese. And now he's working for a large Israeli-American firm in Shanghai. And Yoav has always believed that strong commercial ties between Israel and China are vital for Israel's future, and he's committed to helping to build those ties. But breaking into the Chinese market, he has found out, is tough. Competition is stiff. And Yoav has been rather anxious about it. So here we have a big Israeli kid with a big Israeli problem called breaking into the Chinese market. And then we have a daughter, our middle child, the daughter, our island of tranquility, our daughter, who is studying for an advanced degree in education in Beersheba. And some time ago, I spoke to her in Beersheba, and I spoke to her between sirens that were alerting the people of Beersheba to incoming terrorist missiles from Gaza that were falling on the city. Now, in America, certainly, I don't know about the West Coast, but on the East Coast, we have things called snow days. In southern Israel, you have rocket days. Rocket days are days when you don't go to school, you don't go to work, you spend the day in a bomb shelter, and Leah was spending those days in a bomb shelter. And she was anxious about losing class time. She works as a tutor, educational tutor. She was anxious about losing hours as a tutor. She was anxious about whether she could make the 200-yard sprint from her apartment to the nearest bomb shelter in time, because you only have about 52 seconds from the time that siren goes off to the time the missile actually lands. So here we have a big Israeli kid with a very big Israeli problem. And then finally, there's our little baby, our baby boy, Noam, who is 22 years old. And Noam has already completed a year of voluntary national service, after which he, too, tried out, was accepted to an elite unit in the IDF. And he graduated from officers' corps, and now he is an officer in the IDF. And the same day that I spoke to Leah on her cell phone, I spoke to Noam on his cell phone, and I learned that he, too, was anxious. He just received 30 recruits, 30 18-year-old kids, half of them from disadvantaged backgrounds, because the Israeli army has a program of taking kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and putting them in advanced elite units as a way of encouraging social mobility among them. And Noam had to think about whether he could somehow bring these kids together and make them form a coherent fighting unit. And he said to me, Abba, can I do it? Can I forge them into a working group? Can I someday lead these young people into battle? So here is a big Israeli kid with a very big Israeli problem. Now, our three kids are typical Israeli young people. They grew up in Jerusalem during years of terror. They've seen friends and even a close family member killed in suicide bombing attacks. They've seen two comprehensive peace offers made to the Palestinians in 2000, 2008, only to have those offers rejected by Palestinian leaders. They've seen over 9,000 Israelis uprooted from their homes in Gaza to help advance the peace process, only to receive Hamas and Hamas rockets in return. They've watched throughout much of the last 3 years, when the Palestinian Authority has refused to negotiate with us. And instead, Palestinian leaders praise terrorists. They name squares after them. And they try to make a reconciliation pact with Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. If you read its covenant, it's dedicated not only to the destruction of Israel, it's dedicated to the annihilation of Jews worldwide. It's a genocidal organization. Now, astonishingly, these three young Israelis still support the two-state solution. But rather unsurprisingly, they doubt that there's anybody really on the other side who is either willing or capable of carrying out that solution. But more than the Palestinian issue, these typical Israeli youth worry more about the relationship between the state of Israel and its ultra-Orthodox citizens. They worry more about the cost of housing for young people. It's a huge problem in Israel. They worry about the 10,000 rockets in the arsenal of Hamas. They worry about the 60,000 rockets in the hands of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They worry about the massive stockpiles of unconventional weaponry in the hands of the Syrians. And as we see that the Syrian state is torn asunder and may disintegrate, they worry where those weaponries might end up. They worry about an Iranian regime which never misses an opportunity to share its dream of wiping Israel off the map. Just this week, the head of the Iranian armed forces said that it is the commitment of the Iranian government to fully annihilate the state of Israel. Said it publicly. Big Israeli kids, monumental Israeli problems. Monumental. In America, meanwhile, here there are other concerns. Finding a job, for one, not losing your home. Talk about big and stressful problems, certainly big and stressful. More specifically, there are American Jewish concerns, such as ensuring Jewish continuity, maintaining Jewish institutions, affording a Jewish education, quite expensive. All are genuinely serious concerns, and not just for American young people. I was shocked then that on the very day that I spoke with my kids, when Leah was worrying about getting to that bomb shelter and Noam was worried about leading his young recruits into battle and sharing their concern as Israeli youth, American Jews, at least some of them, were discussing the possibility of boycotting products made by Israelis living in the West Bank. Now, as an ambassador, it's my duty to follow that debate very, very closely. And I was curious to know, firstly, whether anybody thought that that boycott could actually be implemented. As you know, we are a high-tech giant. We make many of your computer components. If you have Intel in your computer, if you've got Israel in your computer, could you separate the computer chips that may or may not have been made by people living on the West Bank from the actual computer itself? How actually technically could it be implemented? I was further curious to know how, in the absence of a Palestinian willingness to actually sit at the negotiating table with us, how that boycott could somehow advance the two-state solution. And I wondered whether those calling for the boycott realized how much they strengthened the case for boycotting all Israeli products and delegitimizing the Jewish state. I wondered how they understood or felt the historic resonance of calling for a boycott of Jews and what that means, and merely on the basis of where they lived, geographically. But what struck me most, and not as an ambassador, but as an Israeli father, was that on the same day that my son was worrying about his war recruits and my daughter was worrying about whether she could reach the shelter while rockets were falling on Beersheba, a portion of the American Jewish community was debating whether or not to buy Ahava hand products. Ahava hand products, you should know, many of them are made on the West Bank. Now, something's wrong here. Something's terribly wrong. When I grew up in this country, the slogan of the United Jewish Appeal, some of you will remember it, was, "We are one." Remember it? Today, that same logo is more likely to raise eyebrows than it is to raise funds. Now, no doubt, a great majority of American Jews care deeply about the security of Israel, and they oppose those seeking to undermine that security. And even though some of those calling for boycotts do so out of a sense of caring, I would say a misplaced sense of caring about Israel. And yet, sometimes it seems that we, American Jews and Israelis, not only inhabit different countries, but we inhabit different universes. We inhabit different realities. A recent research by my old classmate, Professor Stephen M. Cohen, indicated American Jews, when they're asked about what they care about in Israel, care most about women and minority rights in the Jewish state. They care about equality between the major streams of Judaism in Israel. Now, those issues are also important to us as Israelis, but we're also interested in making a living and gaining social benefits. We're interested in protecting our families so that we can actually enjoy those livings, enjoy those benefits. And it's ironic that at a time in this country where support for Israel is at nearly an all-time high, indeed, it's one of the truly bipartisan issues in Congress, an issue on which Democrats and Republicans can fully agree, we Jews can seem to be increasingly divided. over the issue of Israel. Let me make this clear. What's at stake here is not merely Israel's policies or the rights of American Jews to criticize them. At stake, I believe, is nothing less than the unity of the Jewish people. Now, throughout most of our history, that unity was taken for granted. As a graduate student, I spent a lot of time studying medieval Jewish documents that have been found in the Cairo synagogue, written in Judeo-Arabic, wonderful language. They were from the 8th century. And you read these documents, and you saw very clearly that well over 1,000 years ago, there was a Jewish people. You could be a Jew in Cairo, and you could travel eastward to Mumbai or westward to Frankfurt, and you would be received by the local Jewish community. They would take you in. They'd give you shelter. They'd give you food. You could even cash a check thousands of miles away. Amazing. Over 1,000 years ago. We partook in a tradition that was thousands of years old. We were mishpocha. And if we ever forgot there were mishpocha, there was a hostile environment that would readily remind us that we were mishpocha. So we were bound by our tradition, but also by our rather unfriendly surroundings. But all that began to change. It changed very rapidly during the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. And suddenly the ghetto walls collapsed. And there was a great outpouring of spiritual and political energy that was released. Suddenly there were Reform Jews, and there was conservative Jews, and there were Orthodox Jews. And Jews were not only in the shmata business, but they were in the medical business. They were in the business of running countries. Tremendous revolution. Suddenly there were Central European Jews and Eastern European Jews. If you went further east, there were Sephardic Jews. There were nationalist Jews who thought of themselves first as Frenchmen, and Jews who thought of themselves as Italians first. And there were communists who said that they weren't quite Jews anymore, but members of an international proletariat. Most peripheral were the Zionist Jews, who wanted to be both people of the Enlightenment and people of the book. And they were Western and Eastern Jews together, nationalists and communists, farmers, soldiers, and scientists. The Zionists, very dynamic, but they attracted very little support, and more often than not, they attracted derision. In this country, the United States, on the eve of the First World War, there were more than 2.5 million Jews here, and less than 10,000 of them were Zionists. Now, much of that changed with the Second World War. All of a sudden, Reform Jews, conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews, Central Eastern European, Sephardic Jews, communists, nationalists, Zionists, all of them were reunited on the trains to Auschwitz. It took the Holocaust to get us to rethink the meaning of Jewish peoplehood. Were we Jews simply because the anti-Semites said we were Jews? That was Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy. Or were there positive aspects to Jewish identity that transcended all cultural, ritual, and political differences and bound us together eternally? For a great many, the answer was unequivocally yes. We are Jews. Not because the anti-Semites say we're Jews, but because we revere a tradition. We belong to a community, and we share a birthright in the land of Israel. And as an affirmation of that identity, in an act of national will unrivaled in human history, we rose. In 3 short years, from the ashes of the Holocaust, we rose and we created our ancient state, the state of Israel. That state belongs to each and every one of you in a way that no other state can. Because your part in that state is not contingent on your place of birth, it's not contingent on your passport, but it is contingent on a membership in a people, in a membership in the Jewish people that has spanned the globe both geographically and historically. Israel is our state. It is a work in progress in which every Jew can take part. Now, of course, sovereignty is messy business, very messy. And Jews can and will disagree about Israeli policies, without necessarily loving Israel any less. People often ask me, how do you define pro-Israel? What does it mean to be a Jew who is pro-Israel? And I have developed some rather elementary answers. The person who is pro-Israel recalls what Jewish life was like without a Jewish state, and that person works to ensure that there always will be a Jewish state. The pro-Israel person is grateful for every day that he or she knows that he or she lives in a time in Jewish history in which there exists a proud and independent Israel. The pro-Israel person is the one who sees the controversies, yes, and can have some strong opinions about them. That person may believe that by removing all the settlements on the West Bank, peace will ensue tomorrow. Or, conversely, that person may believe that by removing all the settlements, it'll bring about the opposite of peace. Either way, a pro-Israel person knows that there is a place at our table for divergent views. But irrespective of politics, the pro-Israel person asks, how can I contribute to Israel? How can I enrich it? And how can I be, in turn, enriched by it? You know, I attend synagogues across the United States, and I see how the majority of American Jewish congregations, have adopted the Sephardic form of Hebrew, which is the type of Hebrew that we speak in Israel. But I also see the profound influence of American Jewish ritual on Israeli Judaism. When I go back to my synagogue in Jerusalem, we sing songs written by Shlomo Carlebach, an American Jewish rabbi. We see how egalitarian minions have started to form in Israel through the influence of American Jewry. And it's in many other fields, and technology as well. You know, a third of electricity now for the city of Eilat is being provided by solar panels devised by one Yosef Abramovich of Boston, who just happened to be visiting the area and decided this city could really use some solar panels. He's from Boston. And that to me, that's mutual enrichment at its finest. And it cuts two ways. It's the same thing true as in scholarship, in the joint high-tech campuses between Israel and the United States that are now being built in New York and Chicago. In the arts, just out of curiosity, how many people have seen the television series In Treatment and Homeland? Boy, I should tell the producers of Homeland. They'd be very depressed. Both of those are Israeli series. They've been adopted from Israeli television for the American screen. A pro-Israel person appreciates the immense threats that the people of Israel face every single day. She knows that Israel alone cannot bring about peace with the Palestinians, but that the Palestinians have agency. They have the responsibility to denounce terror, to reject Hamas, and to accept the legitimacy of a permanent Jewish state. The pro-Israel person understands that understands the threats to Israel of not achieving peace, but also understands the threat of achieving a peace that will quickly unravel and transform the West Bank into something that resembles southern Lebanon or Gaza. The pro-Israel person empathizes with those who live under the constant threat of missile attack, of other terrorist attacks, and empathizes with those who not only risk their lives, but who devote their lives to defending the Jewish state. The pro-Israel person recognizes the supreme danger of a nuclear-armed Iran and acknowledges what President Obama has said publicly, that Israel has the right to defend itself against any Middle Eastern threat, and that only Israel as a sovereign nation can best decide how to defend its citizens. Finally, a pro-Israel person takes pride in Israel's incalculable successes. In our world-class universities, our pioneering achievements in medicine, economics, in alternative energies, in the fact that we have more technological patents, more scientific papers, more Nobel Prizes than any other country in the world per capita, that after Canada, we're the most educated country in the world per capita, that our stock market in Tel Aviv is rated the best investment in the world, in case you have any expendable capital. Tel Aviv is also listed as the third most fun city in the world and the most gay-friendly city in the world. There's actually International Gay Pride Week in Tel Aviv this week. We have the only growing Christian population in the Middle East. It's surprising statistics. Israeli Arab Christians are per capita better educated and more affluent than Israeli Jews. We're part of a very exclusive club. We're a democracy, and less than half the countries in the world are democracies. We're older than half of that half as a democracy, 64 years old, and we're part of a very exclusive club. We're part of a club of those countries that have never known a second of non-democratic rule. You know how small that club is? It's United States, Canada, New Zealand, Britain. In spite of the fact that we've been subjected to unspeakable pressures that have crushed democracies throughout history, we're still democratic. Not a nanosecond of non-democratic rule. All of that, and we export wine to France. Love that. The pro-Israeli person sees Israelis, left, right, religious, secular, not as some distant other, but as part of a whole, a dynamic, creative, yes, rambunctious, and precious whole. The pro-Israel people are those who even view those who disagree with them politically as part of their people, as mishpocha. We are a small people, but we face big problems. We are a small people with immense achievements, but we are a people. And it is because we are a people that we are able to overcome adversity. Peoplehood is the secret to our success. But peoplehood must not be taken for granted. It must be nurtured, it must be strengthened, and invigorated. And the responsibility cuts two ways. We in Israel must do a better job in respecting and recognizing the diversity of American Jewish life. Just as we ask who is the pro-Israel person, so too must we ask ourselves who is pro-Jewish. In Israel, to be pro the Jewish people is to guarantee a respectful place for egalitarian prayer at the Kotel. It is to maintain a dialogue over the conversion issue. It is to enable open debate about those Israeli policies that impact all of world Jewry. Together, we must invest in our future as a people. We must not only enable more American Jews to participate in what is called broadly Israel experiences, particularly the Birthright program. And I was distressed to learn that 57% of the young American Jews in the Seattle area who apply for Birthright don't have a place in Birthright because there's not enough funds. And we know that many of these young American Jews, if they apply to Birthright once and are turned down for lack of a space, won't apply again. And we've lost that opportunity. We have to make sure that they have that opportunity. Conversely, we must expand the number of Israeli participants in these programs. All three of my kids have participated in American Jewish Israel experiences as counselors. And each of them has emerged with a deeper sense of appreciation of the Jewish people, of a sense of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish nation. We must seek ways to perform tikkun olam together as a people. American Jews, diaspora Jews, Israeli Jews join in humanitarian projects worldwide. Some of us remember those images of sacks of grain and flour that were sent to developing countries that said, "A gift of the people of America." Remember those? I'd like to see someday parcels of medicine and food being shipped around to needy places in the world that said that it would be blazoned with the logo, "A gift of the Jewish people." We must find more venues in which Jews from all backgrounds and outlooks can talk candidly to one another, and no less crucially, we must find better venues for listening. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. Our very existence, our raison d'etre, is predicated on that peoplehood. Yes, we face daunting challenges, but with the Jewish people united and behind us, we can overcome all of them, just as we have in the past. That's why the great task facing us today is to preserve our unity. We must dedicate ourselves to reinforcing a sense of oneness, of community, and of connection to the land. Israel is predicated on peoplehood, but the life and vitality of the Jewish people is dependent on Israel, which is why our other great task today is to defend our state, to invest in it, and to rejoice in it. To unite the Jewish people and to strengthen the Jewish state, that is our dual duty. To create a world of one Jewish universe, of one Jewish reality. A world in which our kids are your kids. A world in which our problems, no matter how big, belong to us all, and so too do our accomplishments. That is a world in which the Jewish people and the Jewish state are and will remain forever inseparable. Thank you. Now I'll drink the water. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Phil Roberts. I'm the Washington State AIPAC Chair, and I'm also on the board of the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, and it's my honor to ask some questions that have been handed in. So please continue to hand in questions. The first question is, what should the U.S. do to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons capability? And how can sanctions be tightened without China and Russia on board?
Well, China and Russia are on board to a certain degree, but we believe that the best way, the best hope we have for dissuading Iran from pursuing military nuclear capability is a combination of truly crippling sanctions, and shortly the European energy sanctions are going to kick in, and they will deal a further blow to the Iranian economy. That combined with a credible military threat. Our policy, the policy of the Obama administration, is that all options remain on the table. Recently, Secretary of Defense Panetta has said that the United States has conducted and completed extensive planning for military contingencies vis-a-vis Iran. It's not enough that we say this. The leadership in Iran has to believe us when we say this. And when they internalize the fact that they can make a very simple choice. Either they have a nuclear military program or they will remain in power. They cannot have it both ways. When they internalize that, then maybe they'll be dissuaded. But it's very important that we do keep all those options on the table, and Iran must understand that not only Israel, but as President Obama said, we are determined to prevent Iran from acquiring military nuclear capabilities.
So is there something more the United States should be doing other than what they're doing now?
I think the United States has done a remarkable job in leading the world in imposing sanctions. We've seen that these sanctions have had a major impact on the Iranian economy. High unemployment, the Iranian currency is in something of a free fall. Unfortunately, what we haven't seen is that the sanctions have had a major impact on the nuclear program. According to the most recent report of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the sanctions may have the effect of actually accelerating the program. They've been speeding up the enrichment of uranium in Iran and developing a missile program that can carry nuclear warheads, moving larger parts of their program underground into fortified, inaccessible facilities. That's what the United States has done. It's very important as negotiations proceed with the Iranians that the Iranians understand that they will not be able to spin out these negotiations indefinitely while they spin out enriched uranium, and that there's going to be a day of reckoning for them when they're going to have to make that decision that I described earlier.
Here's a question. Due to the geographic realities, this person is skeptical about a two-state solution. Is a one-state solution in any way possible while remaining a Jewish state, even if there becomes an Arab majority?
Well, I don't know what the skepticism about the geographical reality is. If you're referring to the presence of the settlements, all the settlements together account for far less than 2% of the West Bank, and we have committed ourselves to creating a territorially viable and contiguous Palestinian state. So I don't think the geographical realities in any way preclude the emergence of a territorially viable and contiguous Palestinian state. A binational state is not feasible. There is only one Jewish state. There are 21 Arab states. I don't think we need another Arab state. I think binational state simply means the end of the Jewish state. And binational states are working swimmingly in the Middle East. They're working great in Lebanon. They're working great in Iraq. Working wonderfully in Syria. I don't think we should use those examples as our paradigms. The answer to our conflict is two states for two peoples, a Jewish state, which is the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel, living side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition, I stress mutual recognition, with the Palestinian state.
Going on, continuing on that theme, what would a good outcome to the Arab Spring look like to Israel, and is that possible?
Mm-hmm. We've long said that we are proud to be the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. We would be prouder and happier still to say that we were one of many functional democracies in the Middle East. And the outcome of the Arab Spring would be the emergence of democratic and peace-loving, I stress, governments in all of our neighborhood. Whether that's going to happen and when it's going to happen is a question that historians will have to ponder in retrospect. You maybe refer to that famous story of Kissinger asking Zhou Enlai, the Chinese leader, whether he thought the French Revolution was a success. And Zhou responded, well, it's too early. Too early to tell. You can say the same thing about the upheaval throughout the Arab world. Right now, our major concern is maintaining the peace with Egypt, which is the cornerstone of our regional strategic interests and has been for more than 3 decades. And Egyptian leaders have said that they intend to maintain that peace. We welcome that commitment. Our major concern is with the situation in Sinai, which is where much controls have been lost and terrorists have been operated. We've had 2 terrorist attacks launched from Sinai. And there's a spill out of Gaza, of terrorism from Gaza into Sinai. We have to be very, very cautious about that. The situation in Syria we see as an opportunity because Bashar al-Assad's father, some of you remember Hafez al-Assad, he was ruthless, but he was predictably and responsibly ruthless. His son is unpredictably and recklessly ruthless. And in addition to killing 10,000 of his own citizens, they've also provided these 60,000 rockets to Hezbollah. And he tried to create a military nuclear program a while back with the help of Iran and North Korea. These are real game changers, all of these. So he's reckless. We wanted to see him go, but we have to be very cautious about what replace him. We've had some bad experiences in history where revolutions that begin as largely secular, democratic, pro-Western revolutions get hijacked by radicals because the radicals are much better organized and funded and led. And that happened in Iran, it happened in Lebanon, it happened in Gaza. We saw it happen in Egypt very, very quickly. And so we have to be very cautious because Syria does have an immense quantity of weapons of mass destruction. And it's not conjecture, folks. The United States and Israel, we all agree on it. And we have to make sure that those remain in some type of responsible care.
If Israel is forced to attack Iran alone, what can our community do to help?
Well, we hope that will never happen. Keep in mind that Israel has the greatest stake in a peaceful outcome of the negotiations. We are living next door to Iran. Our country and no other country is threatened with annihilation by Iran. And so we hope that it never comes to that. Yes, we have not only the right and the duty, but the ability to defend ourselves. But we hope never to use it. Remember Noam and Leah, my kids in Israel? Or Yoav, who's going to return to Israel? I mean, we have the skin in the game, the ultimate. So we hope never to use it. What you can do is to uphold Israel's right. And that is a right that, again, that is recognized by the government of the United States. And it is an unassailable and incontestable right. Every country in the world has the right to defend itself. But I think given the particular tragic history of the Jewish people, particularly in the last century, that right is sacrosanct.
How can we effectively combat the prevalent hostility to Israel on American college campuses?
Well, I have to qualify that a bit. There are 3,000 American college campuses. And you can go to a campus such as recently I went to the Colorado Christian College, and I was greeted by 900 cheering students even before I opened my mouth. There are different college campuses and different attitudes to Israel, but on many college campuses we do face challenges, and very often I go to at least one university every month, and I'm very often greeted by protesters or sometimes hecklers in the audiences. The answer to this is threefold. We face three challenges that we have to meet. First is what the activities going on campuses, the extracurricular activities, anti-Israel speakers who come to campus. And there are organizations that have done wonderful work in combating this. I know some of you are involved with Stand With Us. AIPAC has programs that respond to this. The embassy also is involved in combating anti-Israel activities on campuses, but these are extracurricular. And if some of you have kids in college, or if you are somebody in college, you know that young people don't have a lot of spare time on campuses. So that is, in many ways, the least of our challenges. A far steeper challenge is what goes on in the classroom, is providing students with a fair and balanced picture of Israel. It doesn't have to be propaganda, but just fair and balanced. And that means creating Israel studies programs and giving Israel study courses that are available on campuses. And here, too, much is being done. There are organizations, ICC, the Schusterman Foundation, that are creating chairs in Israel studies. There are about 25 chairs now across the United States. I don't know if there's one at the University of Washington. But Brandeis University has a brilliant program where they take professors who have tenure in other fields, and nuclear physicists, and they give them a 6-week course on Israel studies. They send them to Israel, and then they come back to their campuses as tenured professors who teach Israel studies. And they've done this with like 180 professors so far. Brilliant. The last challenge is really the most difficult of all, and that is to impact what is on the syllabus. Because you can put young people into a class of Israel studies, but if they have books that are anti-Israel or unfair, it doesn't help. And to promote research on Israel studies is very expensive and time-consuming. I know, I used to be in the field. And someday I'll go back to that field. But it is truly an immense challenge we face. And we have to, we have a tremendous amount of work yet to be done.
You mentioned a peace hiatus. I have heard many remarks and excuses why the Palestinians can't or don't come to the negotiating table. On the other hand, I don't see Netanyahu sitting at the table, drumming his fingers and asking, where are they?
In fact, he's sitting at the table, drumming his fingers and asking, where are they? And does it repeatedly, all the time, all the time. Netanyahu, the prime minister, instituted a 10-month moratorium on settlement building. No other prime minister ever did this to encourage the Palestinians back to the table. They didn't come. At least they came at the very end and didn't stay for more than 6 hours. He's removed hundreds of checkpoints and roadblocks to facilitate Palestinian economic growth, and there has been significant growth in the West Bank. The list of gestures that we've made, most recently we returned the bodies of nearly 100 Palestinian terrorists that had been interred in Israel as a gesture to strengthen the Palestinian Authority, to get them to come back to the negotiating table. Our position, the position of the Obama administration, the position of the quartet, calls for the immediate resumption of talks without preconditions, direct talks without preconditions. The only ones who reject that position right now are the Palestinians. And it's unfortunate because the Prime Minister has come out publicly, most recently in front of a joint session of Congress, and said that he knows that if we make peace with the Palestinians, there'll be Israeli settlements beyond our borders. This is the head of the Likud party, folks. He says that with creativity and goodwill, we can resolve the issue of Jerusalem, and he understands that the Palestinians have their position on Jerusalem, and he expects them to bring it to the negotiating table. And he has said that if the Palestinians negotiate earnestly, in good faith, that we can conclude an agreement with them on a two-state solution within 1 year. He said that. And unfortunately, they haven't responded yet. We have had some indications over the last few weeks of greater willingness to interact with us, first under the auspices of the Jordanians. There were some talks. There's been an exchange of letters between us and the Palestinian Authority. We've had some, there was actually a meeting at the Prime Minister's residence a few weeks ago between Palestinian and Israeli negotiators. What can I say? We hope that they return to the negotiating table. If they come to that negotiation, they will find an Israeli government which is the largest and most representative government in Israel's history. Very stable, national unity government. That is a government that can deliver. We have to make painful sacrifices. We know the painful sacrifices we have to make. We understand the Palestinians have to make painful sacrifices. There's no shortcuts here. At the end of the day, there's going to be a border. And guess what? There are going to be Jews who are going to be happy with that border. There are going to be Palestinians unhappy with that border. There's going to be a border. And we'll find a solution for every outstanding issue. Refugees, security, mutual recognition in Jerusalem. We can find a solution, but only if they sit down and talk with us. There's no shortcuts.
Let's talk about Turkey for a minute. Turkey used to be
Talk
a strong. Let's talk Turkey. That's right. Turkey used to be a strong ally of Israel. So what is Israel doing about its relationship with Turkey, and in particular, its reaction to the lawsuit in Turkey based on the boarding of the ship that was trying to break the blockade?
Okay, we have to go back a little bit in history. We had a very close alliance with Turkey for many years. About 14 years we had joint maneuvers with the Turks. A very strong commercial relationship, a tourist relationship. About 400,000 Israelis visited Turkey every year. I used to go to Turkey quite often. Love Turkey. Great people, wonderful food, wonderful beaches and antiquities. There was an election in Turkey in 2002. A new government came into power that had a much more religious and Middle Eastern orientation. The Turks had tried to get into the European Union. They were rejected. They turned back to their Middle Eastern roots. And sought to regain some of their previous preeminence in the Middle East as a Middle Eastern country, which is perfectly legitimate. Unfortunately, that didn't naturally accord with close ties with the Jewish state. And several years ago, before the flotilla incident of May 2010, the Turks canceled their joint maneuvers with us and began to move away. But the issue did come to a rather unfortunate head in the flotilla incident, in which 16 boats sailed toward Gaza to break our maritime blockade of the Gaza Strip, which we view as vital to our security, because it's via the sea that those 10,000 rockets have reached Hamas from Iran and Syria. And one of those ships was a very large ship called the Mami Marara, on which members of an Islamic radical group, the IHH, it's a group that's actually recognized by 2 European states as a terrorist group, not just as a radical group, had gotten aboard on a different Turkish port. They weren't inspected for arms, and when all the other 15 boats turned away when we warned them, the Mami Marara did not. We couldn't stop it by technical means, so we had naval SEALs land on it with paintball guns and sidearms. But when they were set upon by these IHH thugs with iron bars and knives and guns, we dug some slugs out of our guys that weren't from our guns. They exercised their right to self-defense, and 9 Turkish nationals, unfortunately, were killed. And this created a tremendous controversy, you'll remember. Then we did the unthinkable. We did one of the craziest things that Israel's ever done in its annals of its foreign policy. We submitted the flotilla incident to UN arbitration. Imagine that. Thinking of the UN is actually going to give us a fair shake. And then a modern miracle happened here in Sinai. The UN came down on our side. Who ever heard of such a thing? They upheld the legality of the maritime blockade of Gaza. They found it was necessary for Israel's defense. They upheld the fact that our soldiers had to act in self-defense against violence. They found fault with the degree to which they exercised their right of self-defense. But they made some suggestions. The arbitration made several suggestions. One was that we enter into a dialogue with the Turks to try to ameliorate our relationship. Another was that we express regret for the death of the 9 Turkish nationals and that we pay compensation to their families. We accepted the findings of this arbitration. The Turks rejected it, and reject it to this day. Actually, last week we actually made a formal offer of compensation. What can I say? We keep on trying behind the scenes to try to get back on the right track with the Turks. We do, and we're not giving it up because we greatly respect the people of Turkey The Jewish people have had a 500-year-long friendship with the people of Turkey. They were the people who gave us shelter from the Spanish Inquisition. And by the way, we still have a very vibrant commercial relationship with Turkey, very vibrant. And we look forward to the day when we could go back to being the type to have the friendship that we had in the past.
So, given the status of Gaza, is a peace agreement with the Palestinians at all possible as long as Hamas is in power in Gaza?
Yes, we just have a peace treaty with the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, and we leave the door open to the people of Gaza. And when they look across at the West Bank and see that there's economic development there, the Palestinians have a future for their children and grandchildren, whereas in Gaza, they're still bogged down in Islamic extremism and don't have that type of future. Maybe they'll get rid of Hamas, and then they can join.
Aren't they already seeing that right now, to some extent?
I think to some extent, if you were to take a poll, if you could actually take a poll in Gaza, you'd probably find that. But I don't think they have much of an opportunity to do that.
What is your response to Gershon Gorenberg, author of Israel Democracy, What Threatens It, How to Save It, and his thesis, the occupation must end and there must be equal rights for all inhabitants?
Well, Gershon's a good friend and my neighbor in Jerusalem. I've known him for many years. And we often talk about his books, and there are parts I agree with and parts I disagree with. I think that none of us want to continue the status quo on the West Bank. I think we view it as a threat to our future as a democratic and Jewish state. He's right there. But at the same time, we have to preserve our security interests. We cannot create a situation where Israel withdraws from the West Bank the way it withdrew from Gaza or from southern Lebanon, only to have those vacuums filled by Iran and their proxies and to have thousands of rockets fired at us. You know, I live in southern Jerusalem in an area that was always part of Israel. But the West Bank begins down the street. And if there's a Palestinian state created there, my family is not going to be in rocket range. It's going to be in pistol range. So we have to have ironclad guarantees that if this peace unravels, our population is not going to be threatened by 100,000 rockets. That would be an existential threat for us. At the same time, we have to have a peace treaty in which the Palestinians play a role. The Palestinians are not passive observers here. I mentioned it in my speech. They have agency. They have responsibility. And they're not two-dimensional props for a Jewish morality play. And they make decisions too. And they have to make a decision to accept the responsibility of sovereignty for themselves. And all that occurs. I said sovereignty's messy. They don't seem to really want to take on that mess. And they have to recognize us. And one of our major goals in the peace process, not a precondition, I stress, not a precondition because we know how difficult it is for the Palestinians, but one of our major goals in the Palestinians is to have the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. That is not a semantic goal in any way. It is as fundamental and substantive as you can get. What does that mean when the Palestinians recognize us as the Jewish state? It means that there's reciprocity. We recognize that the Palestinians are a people. And as a people, they are endowed with an inalienable right to self-determination. We need the Palestinians to recognize the Jewish people endowed with an inalienable right to self-determination. Without that mutual recognition, there will never be peace. Without that recognition, a two-state solution will be what Ehud Barak has called a two-stage solution, in which the second solution will be Israel's dissolution. It'll just go on. The irredemptive claims will never end. So there must be an end of claims, end of conflict, and mutual reciprocal recognition.
Do you think that mandatory service will become required for the Haredim? And if so, what would the time frame be?
I don't know about the time frame, but it's certainly an outstanding and painful issue in the state of Israel. And we believe that a solution has to be found for this in a way that all citizens of the state of Israel can serve their state. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a military capacity, but national service, we believe, is an essential part of Israeli identity and an essential part of Israeli democracy.
So maybe you can explain a little bit about the word settlements. I mean, what do people mean when they talk about settlement? Is it a new city in a disputed area or a new apartment in an established neighborhood?
Let's go back, okay? Let's go back. What do we mean by settlements? How did it begin? I mean, the first settlements were made in the wake of the 1967 Six-Day War, 45 years ago today, folks, it started. And there was an Arab-Israeli conflict before the settlement started. There was an Arab-Israeli conflict for about 50 years before the settlement started, so the settlements were not the cause of the conflict. Settlements had two major purposes when they started. One was reclaiming the Jewish homeland. Look in your Bible. There's a Bible in front of you. You will not, if there's an index, if there's a concordance, you will not find the city of Haifa in that Bible. You will not find the city of Tel Aviv in that Bible, or you may, but it's not a city in the land of Israel. It's a city in Babylonia. The cities of the Bible are Jericho, Bethlehem, Hebron, Bethel, of course, Jerusalem. These are the tribal lands of the Jewish people. This is the cradle of our civilization. And for a Jewish state so constituted, could not tell a Jewish person that they could not live in their ancient homeland. So first of all, it goes to the core of our identity. It's why we're there. It's why we're here. Secondly, there was a strategic and defensive reason. Israel, before June 6, 1967, was at its most populous point 8 miles wide. I don't know how wide, metropolitan Seattle is. My guess is it's wider than 8 miles. You could walk across that country in a couple hours. And we had hills to the front of us, the sea to the back. It was not a defensible border. And if you look at the map, 80% of the settlements are in blocks that are designed to thicken out Israel's border and give us a secure border as provided by UN Security Council Resolution 242. Now, the only reason that we would qualify our rights to live in our own homeland and to secure borders is because there's another people that views this area as their homeland, and another people that has claims to the territory, the Palestinians, and we realize that the only way to solve the issue is to sit down and negotiate. And the settlements will be part of those negotiations. They're not the cause of the conflict. We ripped out 21 settlements from Gaza in 2005 and to advance peace, and we didn't get peace. We got Hamas and rockets. So it's not about settlements. But we understand that it's a controversial issue. It's controversial in Israel as well. But the only way to resolve it is at the negotiating table. What do we mean when we say settlements? Settlements can be anything. By our definition, it can be settlements that are within the settlement blocks, which pretty much everyone understands are going to be part of Israel in any future arrangement with the Palestinians. There are distant settlements, and some of those, as the Prime Minister has indicated before Congress, will lie beyond our borders. There are the Jewish neighborhoods of Jewish Jerusalem, in which the majority of Jews in Jerusalem live, and we do not regard them as settlements, but much of the world does, including the United States. And they will be part of the Jewish state as well. And we're talking about, in Jerusalem itself, almost nobody knows where the old 1949 armistice lines ran. If you were to ask the average Jerusalem kid, including my 3 kids, have no idea where the pre-67 borders ran, because they're just gone. They've been gone for 4 decades. So, I think the term settlement you have to use guardedly, and everyone has different interpretations. At the end of the day, it's not about settlements. It's about peace, it's about security, and it's about mutual recognition. The settlement issue will follow.
Last question, so I'm going to make it a two-parter. First, as pro-Israel activists in the United States, what would you like us to be doing that we're not doing or do more of? And also ask you if you want to look into your crystal ball and tell us how you think the sort of what's going on is going to play out in the Middle East right now with Iran in particular. I know that's an unfair question.
As an historian, I used to always say that I have enough problems predicting the past. Nobody could have predicted what happened in the first half of 2011, with which now is, I think, rather malappropriately called the Arab Spring. But no one could predict it. No one knows what's going to happen in a year's time in the Middle East. If anybody tells you what's going to happen in a month's time in the Middle East, in a week's time in the Middle East, don't believe them. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. I can tell you we don't know what the outcome is going to be in Syria. We don't know what the outcome is going to be in Egypt or any other Middle Eastern country. One thing I can tell you with certainty is that Iran will not get nuclear weapons. As for what you can be doing better, what can you be doing more of? Well, I gave you one sort of marching order. Let's make sure that every Jewish young person between the ages of 18 and 26 in the Seattle area has the opportunity to go on birthright. Join us at the table. I've devoted part of my tenure as ambassador over the last 3 years to developing tables. You know, the notion of tables, and Rabbi Wiener, you know this, a table in Judaism is something very sacred. We have the Shulchan Aruch, we have the Passover table, the Seder table. Tables are important. And we want to create a table in which the greatest number of Jews can sit around on the basis of sort of the outlines that I mentioned tonight. What is pro-Israel to sit around that table? We can disagree about settlements. We can disagree about Jerusalem. I can sit with Gershom Gorenberg, because I do sit with Gershom Gorenberg at his table or my table. Sometimes we meet at Kafit on Emek Raphaim Street, and we sit at a table and we discuss. I believe that that table is essential to maintaining and strengthening and reinvigorating the sense of Jewish unity, which I view is essential to our survival and our well-being as people. And we have to learn to talk to one another and to listen to one another in different ways. So I've been reaching out. I recently met with the heads of the Reform movement. I've met with an organization called JCPA, a wonderful organization that brings Jewish leaders together from different perspectives. And traveling around the country, went out to Detroit to meet out with JCPA. And it's always about the table. Let's discuss our differences. And we have them. Let's not try to paper them over. We have, I just came back from Israel last week, and I made a point of visiting the part of the Western Wall, the Kotel, that has been reserved by the Israeli Supreme Court for egalitarian prayer and bar mitzvah ceremonies. Because I had heard at one of these tables that the area hadn't been properly kept, and that this was disrespectful of the major streams of Judaism in this country. And I went and I saw that, first of all, it wasn't true. It was actually quite well kept, but also learned that through the encouraging of our diplomats in this country, that the government, the Prime Minister, has undertaken to completely renovate the area within the next 2 years and expand it from an area now where you can have about 100 worshipers to an area that will have 800 worshipers and have complete handicap access. We need 2 Torah scrolls and 200 Sidurim. I want you to know. Okay? Talk about... We'll build, you will come. It's very nice. Here's a good statistic. The ratio of worshipers to square metrage, you'll have 1 worshiper for every 4 square meters, as opposed to the Kotel, where you have 4 worshipers to every 1 square meter. Okay? That's good news. But you arrive at that type of conclusion by having the table. So I would encourage you to do this in your own community. I know Seattle, the Seattle Jewish community has had differences over areas related to not just to Israel, but other aspects of Jewish identity. And the way to approach this is to sit together and to talk together and to join us. Because at the end of the day, we are a people. We share a reverence for this tradition. We share close to 4,000 years of history. We share a birthright in the state of Israel. And yes, at the end of the day, we are mishpocha.
Thank you.
Thank you. I stay here? I go sit down?
Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Amy Levin Reagan, and I am the president of the Seattle Regional Office of the American Jewish Committee and a member of Temple Deher Sinai. Thank you to Ambassador Oren for your remarks and for responding to our community's questions. AJC is proud to have been asked by the Israeli consulate to organize the visit of Ambassador Oren to Seattle and to have partnered in this effort with Temple Deher Sinai, the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, Stand With Us Northwest, the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, and the JT News. Tonight's event could not have happened without the collective efforts of all of these organizations pulling together in a collaborative way. This working relationship represents the best of the Seattle Jewish community. I particularly want to thank Rabbi Wiener and the staff of Temple de Hirsch for their hard work and attention to the many details involved in staging a large event for a prominent person such as Ambassador Oren. This has been a very meaningful experience for those of us involved in planning Ambassador Oren's visit. He participated in a lunch today organized by AJC with interfaith leaders representing the Episcopal, Methodist, Presbyterian, Catholic, and LDS communities, leaders of the Latino and Asian communities, as well as Rabbi Rosenbaum, Rabbi Borodin, Rabbi Kletenik, and Rabbi Wiener. AJC believes that building bridges between communities helps us reach greater understanding of our shared interests. Our interreligious and intergroup coalitions advance democratic values for all individuals. And while AJC promotes the well-being of the Jewish people and Israel, the threat posed by a nuclear Iran affects all democratic societies. That is why AJC advocates for energy security, so American policy and our economic stability isn't dependent on oil from countries hostile to both the United States and Israel. Building important alliances along diverse ethnic and religious groups helps us all to achieve our goal of the advancement of democratic values for all. Today's lunch was an expression of this human desire to reach common ground despite any differences. For over a century, AJC's high-level diplomacy and strong relationships with global leaders has gained the support of decision-makers around the world on issues critical to a strong and secure Jewish future. In the months prior to the September 2011 meeting of the United Nations and during the meeting itself, AJC engaged in an unprecedented global advocacy campaign in opposition to the Palestinian bid for UN unilateral declaration of independence, to speak out in favor of a negotiated two-state solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. AJC views this as the only path to a meaningful and lasting peace. We have had some challenging times in our Seattle Jewish community recently that have called upon us to stay united as we responded. From polarizing anti-Israel bus advertisements, to boycotts of Israeli goods, to hate-provoking speakers. AJC recognizes that the campaign against Israel's legitimacy, and with it, the calling into question of the Jewish people's right to self-determination and to defend itself, is a serious threat facing Israel and its supporters today. We must all continue to counter these divisive efforts and not let them divert the objective of a strong Israel on the ground and in public opinion. Working together as a community, as we have done in connection with this visit of Ambassador Oren, the Seattle Jewish organizations can accomplish this objective. We are so fortunate to have Ambassador Michael Oren as the representative of the State of Israel to the United States. He is a man of extraordinary intelligence and skill, which are both needed to weave the diplomatic path during these most challenging and complex times. We thank him for his friendship with our country and with the many Jewish organizations represented here tonight. Thank you.
So just one last remark. My name is Wendy Rosen. I'm the Regional Director of AJC in Seattle. And before we close, I know he has been thanked already twice, but I can't let the evening go by without thanking our friend Akiva Tor. Akiva has been an invaluable resource and a dear friend to many of us here in Seattle. I personally have had the privilege to join Akiva on many meetings with faith leaders, with members of the community, with elected officials, with the media, and with college students. He cares very, very deeply about the challenges that we have faced here in the Pacific Northwest. The vocal and active campaign to delegitimize the State of Israel weighs on our friend Akiva, and it is an issue that he deals with and has worked to overcome every day during his tenure. So he gave us a gift of bringing Ambassador Oren as a thank you. I think our gift to him is that when he goes back to Jerusalem, he doesn't have to look at his cell phone and see area code 206 call anymore with the source of the day. So Akiva, we wish you the very best of luck. We thank you for everything you have done for us. And I just wanted to say to everyone, thank you to Akiva Tor. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and good night.